At first, when I heard the shot, I thought it was just another hunter being stupid on public land. We lived far enough out in the countryside that the crack of a rifle on a Saturday wasn't exactly news. But then came the screaming. And not the kind you brush off, either. It was Caleb's voice, high and breaking, cutting through the trees like a knife. I dropped the bags of feed right there in the driveway and ran, heart pounding so hard I couldn't even hear my boots hitting the gravel. When I crested the hill leading to the south pasture, I froze. Caleb was on his knees in the dirt, clutching at Biscuit's tiny neck, and all I could see was the red blooming across the little horse's white coat. Biscuit, the one Caleb had trained for 3 years, the one he brushed every morning, who knew how to bow and dance and nuzzle him for treats. A man stood a few yards away, rifle still slack in his hand, looking around like he was the one who ought to be mad. And just beyond him, arms crossed and smug as a queen, was Karen Wilkins. I swear in that moment, if murder was legal, I'd have left her in that pasture with her stupid pearls and her clipboard. They said it was an accident. They said a miniature horse shouldn't have been roaming wild. But when the sheriff found out who gave permission, let's just say, it was Karen's last day outside a courtroom. 3 hours earlier, the morning had been the kind that made you believe the world was still good. The sun was rising in a soft orange haze over the hills, the dew clung to the fences like silver lace, and Caleb was already out in the pasture with Biscuit. That little horse was a miracle in itself, no bigger than a large dog, smart as a whip, and absolutely glued to my son's side like he was born to protect him. Caleb whistled and Biscuit spun in a neat little circle, rearing back on his hind legs before lowering into a perfect bow. Caleb tossed him a piece of carrot and ruffled his shaggy mane, grinning ear to ear. This was supposed to be their big week. The state youth championship. If they placed well, it meant a shot at regional sponsorships, travel, maybe even scholarships down the line. After everything Caleb had been through losing his mom, watching him find purpose again with Biscuit was the kind of thing that made a father's chest ache and swell all at once. I was oiling the hinges on the old stock trailer when Karen's voice slithered through the morning peace like a thorn vine. She stood at the edge of our property, one orthopedic shoe tapping impatiently against a dirt clod, holding a clipboard so tightly it looked like she wanted to beat someone with it. Karen Wilkins wasn't technically the HOA president, but she might as well have been. She hovered over every fence post, every porch light, every child's tree swing like she was the warden of some suburban prison. And for reasons only known to God and her hairdresser, she had taken a particular dislike to our ranch. She waved at me with the kind of energy that made you feel you were already guilty of something. "Morning," I said, not slowing down. "Morning," she snapped back, marching toward the fence. "I'm doing a perimeter check. HOA board business." "Perimeter of what?" I asked without looking up. "You don't own anything past your mailbox." She sniffed, pretending she didn't hear the sarcasm. "We're concerned about unauthorized activity. Stray animals. Security breaches." I looked at Biscuit, who was currently trying to balance a stick on his nose at Caleb's command, and fought the urge to laugh. "Yeah, real dangerous criminal right there." Karen peered past me, writing something furiously on her clipboard. Probably citing me for excessive livestock joy or some other nonsense. I let her ramble about community standards and code enforcement, while I finished my work, not giving her the satisfaction of an argument. Eventually she flounced back to her golf cart, narrowly avoiding running over a chicken. I should have known something was up when I saw her whispering into her phone before she left. Karen didn't just monitor. She meddled. She poked and prodded and stirred things until something snapped, and this time, it wasn't going to be a creaky porch step or an unapproved mailbox color. Around noon, I packed Caleb into the truck so we could pick up a few supplies for the show. New halters, some bedding for the travel crate, and a special peppermint treat for Biscuit that Caleb had saved up for himself. We weren't gone more than 2 hours. When we turned back onto the ranch road, the first thing I noticed was the parked trucks. 3 of them. Mud-splattered, loaded down with camo gear, hunting rifles openly racked across the tailgates. My stomach dropped. I floored the gas, roaring up the driveway. Caleb started yelling before the truck even stopped, jumping out before I could grab him. I slammed the gearshift into park and tore after him. And then I saw it. Biscuit lying in the dirt like some discarded stuffed toy, his tiny chest barely moving. The blood. The boot prints trampling my carefully tended pasture. The hunters, some of them laughing, others looking annoyed. And Karen, standing there like she was hosting a barbecue. Sheriff Lenny's cruiser was already pulled up near the gate. He was talking low and furious to one of the hunters, who was holding up his hands like he didn't know what he did wrong. I marched straight toward Karen, who immediately threw up a hand like she was expecting applause. "I authorized a controlled hunt," she said brightly. "Community safety. Wild hogs, you know. Dangerous pests." I couldn't find words. For once in my life, I couldn't even find anger. It was just a blank, cold nothing. "You authorized?" I finally choked out. "As acting safety liaison for the HOA, yes," she said, puffing up like a pigeon. "I signed the forms myself. You should be thanking me." Sheriff Lenny walked up then, his face unreadable. He handed Karen a small yellow card. "You're gonna want to read that real carefully," he said. "It's your official notice of investigation." Karen's smile flickered. "Investigation? For criminal trespass," Lenny said. "And reckless endangerment." But I had permission." "From yourself?" Lenny said, his voice razor sharp. "On land you don't own? Next to a posted "No trespassing" sign?" Karen's mouth opened and closed like a fish gasping on dry land. Somewhere behind us, Caleb wailed as he rocked Biscuit's tiny, blood-smeared body back and forth. In that moment, looking at my son cradling what was left of his best friend, I knew two things. First, I wasn't going to let Karen weasel her way out of this. And second, she had no idea just how badly she had messed up. Would you like me to continue immediately into Chapter 2 in the same style? It's about to get even crazier from here. Karen stood there, still clutching her clipboard like it was some kind of legal shield, as if the words scribbled on it could undo the disaster she'd caused. Sheriff Lenny didn't even bother arguing with her anymore. He just kept her corralled near the patrol car while deputies took statements from the hunters. I stayed back at first, kneeling next to Caleb, trying to piece together what to do or say when there was really nothing to fix. Biscuit was gone. No emergency vet, no miracle medicine was going to change that. Caleb shook so hard his whole frame rattled. His face was buried in Biscuit's mane, the small sobs punching out of him like someone hitting a drum. The last time I'd seen him cry like that was at his mother's funeral, and that thought hit me harder than any bullet could. It wasn't until an hour later, when the tow truck finally hauled away the hunter's trucks for evidence inspection, that Karen tried to spin the situation. She marched right up to me, ignoring Sheriff Lenny's warning look, and started waving papers in my face. She was ranting about how there were no proper wildlife hazard signs posted and how, technically, our pasture counted as unfenced acreage from the HOA's last property line survey. I stared at her in disbelief, letting her dig her own grave with every word. The pasture had a fence. It wasn't just a little decorative one either. It was a 6-foot post and rail barrier with reinforced wiring, built specifically to keep the animals in and the idiots out. And for good measure, bright red "No trespassing" signs were mounted every 20 feet along the road-facing side, with another set along the wooded rear boundary. Karen was lying through her teeth, and she knew it, but she kept going, her voice rising higher and shriller the more she talked. Sheriff Lenny finally stepped between us and told her in no uncertain terms to keep her mouth shut. He handed me an official incident report form and promised he'd already called the district attorney. The hunters were being held pending illegal hunting charges, unauthorized discharge of a firearm on private property, and possession of banned ammunition. What Karen didn't seem to grasp yet was that by inviting them onto land she had no authority over, she'd roped herself right into the middle of all the criminal liability. And it wasn't just trespass. It was reckless endangerment of minors. Caleb spent half his time out there in that pasture, and if things had gone just a little differently, it could have been my son lying in the dirt instead of Biscuit. That realization made my hands clench into fists so tight my knuckles cracked. When we finally got back to the house, Caleb wordlessly trudged upstairs to his room, shutting the door so softly it somehow hurt worse than if he'd slammed it. I stood in the kitchen for a long while, staring at nothing, before finally pulling out my old legal binder. Over the years, dealing with the HOA's constant harassment had taught me to document everything. Photos, boundary maps, registered letters, audio recordings, the whole arsenal. If Karen wanted a war, she was going to get one, but this time, she wasn't going to be fighting an unarmed opponent. The next day, Sheriff Lenny dropped by with more news. It turned out the hunters Karen had brought onto our land weren't just careless idiots. At least 2 of them had previous convictions for unlawful hunting practices, and one had a suspended hunting license altogether. The ammunition they used, steel core rounds banned in this county for decades, was just the cherry on top. This wasn't a misunderstanding. It was criminal negligence layered so thick you could serve it by the slice. Sheriff Lenny also told me Karen had been warned before, months ago, about overstepping her authority with HOA business. Apparently, she had forged official violation notices against other neighbors, citing them for imaginary infractions like unauthorized flag display or improper garden fencing. I wasn't surprised. Karen lived for the illusion of power, and now it had finally spiraled beyond the petty into the criminal. Meanwhile, Karen kept digging. At an emergency HOA board meeting called that evening, she stormed in waving a folder full of printed screenshots and printouts, claiming she was the real victim. According to her, we had booby-trapped the property by allowing livestock to roam wild and unrestrained, making it an attractive hazard for innocent hunters. The sheer audacity of it almost made me laugh out loud. She even tried accusing Caleb of negligence, because, in her words, minors should not be in charge of dangerous livestock without supervision. Sheriff Lenny sat in the back of the meeting, arms folded, one eyebrow raised so high it practically disappeared into his hat brim. He didn't say a word. He just recorded the whole thing with his body cam, letting Karen hang herself with every hysterical word she spewed. Halfway through her rant, one of the newer board members, a retired judge named Marcy, interrupted her. Calm as you please, Marcy pulled out a manila folder and began reading the actual bylaws aloud, line by line. Nowhere in any version, past or present, did it give HOA officials permission to authorize third-party hunting on private land. Karen went beet red, tried to object, but Marcy just kept reading. The room got quieter and quieter as Karen's empire of nonsense crumbled brick by brick. Finally, when Marcy finished, she looked Karen dead in the eye and said, "You are hereby suspended pending a full investigation." Karen opened her mouth to protest but was cut off by Sheriff Lenny standing up and handing her another legal notice, this time a formal order of appearance for a hearing at the county courthouse. Later that night, Caleb came downstairs, clutching one of Biscuit's old show ribbons. He didn't say anything, just sat next to me on the porch swing and stared out at the dark pasture where the little horse used to run. After a long while, he asked in a hoarse voice if we could plant a tree where Biscuit had fallen. I nodded, my throat too tight to answer. We sat there until the stars came out, the ribbon twisting slowly in Caleb's fingers like a silent promise. I realized then that this fight wasn't just about fences, laws, or HOA drama. It was about standing up when someone tries to steamroll you, about making sure that people like Karen learn there are real consequences for thinking rules only apply to other people. Tomorrow, we'd start digging. Not just for the tree Caleb wanted, but for the truth that would finally bury Karen's arrogance for good. Because as much as she thought this would blow over, she hadn't even seen the storm coming yet. Would you like me to continue immediately with Chapter 3 next, in the same style? It's about to turn into a full public explosion at the HOA hearing. The morning of the emergency HOA hearing arrived hot and heavy, the kind of sticky air that made everything feel like it was about to snap. Caleb had barely spoken more than a few words over the past 2 days, but he insisted on coming with me. He tucked Biscuit's old blue show ribbon into his pocket and squared his shoulders like he was heading into battle. I didn't argue. Part of me wanted Karen to see exactly who she had hurt, to be forced to look into the eyes of the boy she devastated for the sake of her fake authority. The community center parking lot was already packed when we rolled in, a line of pickup trucks, battered sedans, and 1 or 2 golf carts crammed into every available space. Word had traveled fast. By the time we made it through the front doors, the meeting hall was buzzing like a beehive poked with a stick. Karen sat at the head table, flanked by a couple of her loyal cronies from the board, wearing a business suit so tight it looked like it might cut off her circulation. Her hair was pinned back in a severe bun, and she wore a grim expression like she was attending a funeral. Maybe she thought dressing up would make her look official. Instead, it made her look like a scowling mall cop at a discount store opening. Sheriff Lenny stood near the back wall, arms folded, hat tipped low over his eyes as he casually leaned against the exit door. The tension in the room was so thick you could have chipped it off in chunks. The board president, a mild-mannered man named Doug, cleared his throat and called the meeting to order. He read off a list of the evening's topics, but it was all a formality. Everyone knew why they were really here. The death of a beloved miniature horse, unauthorized hunters on private land, forged permissions, the crumbling authority of the HOA. It was the kind of scandal that communities didn't recover from without a few scars. Doug opened the floor for public comment, and that was when the fireworks started. Neighbor after neighbor stood up, each one angrier than the last. They talked about Karen's harassment campaigns, her fake violation notices, her threatening letters. One woman even produced a set of emails where Karen had threatened to have a swing set removed for violating airspace safety codes. It was almost funny if it hadn't been so disgusting. Karen sat through it all with a tight little smirk, tapping her pen against her clipboard like she was counting down the minutes until she could sue everyone for slander. Then, about halfway through, a soft commotion at the back of the room turned heads. Caleb had stood up. He walked to the microphone set up in the aisle, his small hand clutching that faded blue ribbon like a lifeline. I felt my chest tighten so hard I thought I might crack open. He was shaking a little, but when he spoke, his voice was clear, steady, and heartbreaking. He told them about Biscuit. About how he had found the horse abandoned at a county fair 3 years ago, a run no one wanted. How he had saved every allowance dollar, every penny he could find, to buy the supplies Biscuit needed. How he trained him, loved him, and dreamed of riding him into the championship ring. And how, just 2 days before their biggest chance, Biscuit had been gunned down in his own pasture because someone thought rules didn't apply to them. Caleb didn't cry. He didn't shout. He just stood there, laying his grief bare for everyone to see. And when he finished, he gently placed Biscuit's ribbon on the podium and walked back to his seat without another word. The entire room sat in stunned silence. Even Doug had to wipe his eyes before continuing. Karen finally snapped. Maybe it was the silence. Maybe it was the fact that even her usual sycophants were staring at her like she had grown a second head. Whatever it was, she shot to her feet and started shrieking about how none of this was her fault, how she was just trying to protect the community, how dangerous feral livestock were a bigger threat than anyone realized. She pointed at me, at Caleb, at anyone who looked at her wrong. She accused us of setting her up, of exaggerating the damage, even of planting Biscuit in the pasture as some kind of emotional trap. The rant spiraled out of control so quickly that Doug had to slam his gavel down to restore order. But it was too late. The mask had slipped, and now everyone could see what was underneath. Marcy, the retired judge, waited patiently for Karen to run out of breath. Then she stood up and laid out the evidence like she was conducting a courtroom cross-examination. First, she presented the official boundary maps, proving the land was clearly outside HOA jurisdiction. Then came the series of emails Karen had sent the hunters, promising them free-range access to land she neither owned nor managed. Finally, the clincher, the audio recordings Sheriff Lenny had captured of Karen admitting she had to bend the rules to get her friends some good hunting. The final blow came when Lenny produced background checks showing 2 of the hunters had outstanding warrants in other counties. There was a collective gasp from the room. Karen turned a shade of red so deep it looked like she might actually combust. She stammered something about needing her lawyer, But Marcy cut her off cold, reading the motion to have Karen officially removed from the HOA board effective immediately. The vote wasn't even close. It passed unanimously. Karen's cronies abandoned her faster than rats off a sinking ship. Sheriff Lenny stepped forward with the formal court summons, handing it to her with the grim satisfaction of a man who had waited a long time to see justice served. Karen didn't walk out of that meeting. She fled, clutching her purse like it might shield her from the glares and whispered insults that followed her. Someone had quietly placed Biscuit's ribbon in her path as she stormed out, and she stepped right over it without even a glance. That said everything we needed to know about who she really was. Outside, the air felt different. Lighter. People gathered in small groups, talking about changes, about rebuilding trust. Several neighbors came over to shake Caleb's hand, praising him for his courage. Someone even slipped him a small envelope with a note that simply read, "For your next champion." It wasn't about the money. It was about the kindness, the acknowledgement that something terrible had happened and that the community would help heal it. As we drove home under the stars, Caleb finally leaned his head against the window and whispered, "We're gonna plant that tree tomorrow, right?" I smiled, the first real smile in days, and promised him we would. The storm had passed, but we weren't finished yet. Karen still had a court date ahead, and I intended to make sure that every lie, every reckless decision, and every ounce of damage she had caused would be laid bare under the harsh lights of the courtroom. Would you like me to continue immediately with Chapter 4 now, keeping the same energy and flow? It's where we bring everything to a satisfying, emotional, and dramatic close. The courthouse smelled faintly of old paper, lemon polish, and nerves. Caleb sat beside me on the hard wooden bench, his legs swinging just above the floor, his small hands folded tightly in his lap. I didn't know if it was the weight of the moment, or the lingering ache from everything we'd been through, but it felt like the whole world had narrowed to the space inside that courtroom. Across the aisle, Karen sat with her arms crossed and her mouth set in a tight, sour line. Her lawyer, a slick-looking man in an ill-fitting suit, whispered furiously in her ear, but Karen barely responded. She looked tired, deflated, and angrier than ever, a balloon stretched so tight you knew it would pop if you breathed too hard. The judge called the session to order, and just like that, the show began. The prosecution wasted no time laying out the case. They presented the photographs of the pasture, the posted no trespassing signs, the boundary maps that proved Karen had no authority whatsoever over our land. They played the recording of Karen's own voice admitting she gave hunters permission she didn't have. They listed the criminal records of the hunters she invited, the illegal ammunition found, and the fact that her actions directly led to the death of a registered and highly valued animal. They even brought in a veterinary specialist who explained just how devastating the loss of a miniature horse like Biscuit was, not just financially but emotionally, especially to a young owner like Caleb. Every new piece of evidence hit like a hammer, driving the nails deeper into the coffin Karen had built for herself. Karen's lawyer tried everything to wriggle them out of it. He argued that Karen had made an honest mistake, that she believed she had authority as part of the HOA safety committee, that the hunters were rogue elements who acted without her explicit instruction. But no matter how he twisted the words, he couldn't change the facts. Karen had lied. She had meddled. And a living creature had paid the price for her arrogance. When it came time for her to speak, Karen stood up stiffly, smoothing down the front of her jacket like she still believed she could bluff her way through this. She launched into a rambling speech about community safety, about how the neighborhood needed proactive leadership, about how she had only ever acted in the best interests of the residents. She talked about wild hogs, about property values, about everything except the little horse that had died because of her actions. She didn't apologize. Not once. She didn't even look at Caleb. When the judge finally called for victim impact statements, I looked down at Caleb. His face was pale but determined. He gave a tiny nod. I stood up and walked him to the podium, standing just behind him with a hand on his shoulder. Caleb unfolded a crumpled piece of paper and started to read. His voice wobbled at first, but it gained strength with every word. He told the court about Biscuit. About how he had saved him from being auctioned off for slaughter. About how he had taught him tricks, how they had trained every day before school, how he had built special jumps out of scrap wood so Biscuit could practice. He talked about the show they were supposed to attend, the dreams he had held close for so long, and how all of it had been ripped away in one senseless moment. By the time Caleb finished, the courtroom was silent. Even the court clerk wiped her eyes with the sleeve of her robe. The judge sat back in his chair, steepling his fingers under his chin, studying Karen like she was some specimen under glass. When he finally spoke, his voice was low but heavy with finality. He found Karen guilty on multiple counts: criminal trespass, reckless endangerment, destruction of property, and negligence resulting in the death of a registered animal. The penalties were steep. A hefty fine that would sting even someone of Karen's means. A permanent ban from holding any office or committee position in any HOA across the state. Mandatory community service, 500 hours, specifically at an animal rescue facility. And perhaps most satisfying of all, she was ordered to issue a public, court-recorded apology to Caleb, acknowledging her role in Biscuit's death. Karen's face twisted as the judge read the sentence. She opened her mouth as if to argue but must have seen something in his expression that made her snap it shut. There was no negotiating now. The gavel came down with a sharp crack, and just like that, it was over. Karen shuffled out of the courtroom, avoiding eye contact with everyone, looking smaller than I had ever seen her. Her lawyer trailed behind her, already pulling out his phone, probably looking for the nearest exit. Outside the courthouse, a few reporters had gathered, having caught wind of the story from the local paper. They snapped photos as Caleb and I walked past, but we didn't stop. This wasn't about headlines. It was about justice, and about finally closing a chapter that had hurt more than words could say. Sheriff Lenny caught up to us in the parking lot. He clapped Caleb gently on the shoulder and handed him a small paper bag. Inside was a packet of seeds, oak tree seeds. A gift for planting something strong and lasting where something precious had been lost. Caleb smiled, a real smile this time, and thanked him. The next morning, under a soft gray sky, we planted the tree. Caleb chose a spot near the fence line where Biscuit had spent so many afternoons grazing in the sun. We dug the hole together, our hands dirty, our hearts still a little bruised but lighter somehow. Caleb pressed the seeds into the soil, packed the earth around them, and tied Biscuit's old blue ribbon to a nearby post as a marker. It wasn't the grand ceremony some might have expected, but it was perfect. Quiet. Strong. Enduring. Neighbors came by throughout the day, bringing small plants, kind words, and promises of support. Someone left a carved wooden plaque that simply read, Biscuit's Meadow. It wasn't long before word spread about a new community event in the works. A youth equestrian program in Biscuit's honor, aimed at teaching kids about animal care, responsibility, and kindness. Caleb's eyes lit up when he heard about it. He wasn't just healing. He was leading. As for Karen, her house went up for sale less than a month later. No one threw her a farewell party. No one wept when her moving van pulled away. In the end, she left the community the same way she had ruled it, with a lot of noise, a lot of bitterness, and not a shred of the respect she so desperately craved. Life on the ranch found its rhythm again. The new tree grew taller each season, its roots sinking deep into the land that Biscuit had once called home. And every now and then, when the wind was just right, you could almost hear the faint jingle of a tiny halter bell drifting across the fields, a reminder that some bonds never really break. They just grow stronger, stretching across the sky like branches reaching for the sun. Would you also like a polished YouTube description summary next, based on this full story? It could help you post it faster if you want,